Of all the positions I hold and advertise online, I'm pretty sure that my optimism about the future may be the most controversial. It's no secret that you'll run into doomers everywhere on the internet. People who think that humanity is on a trajectory for further misery, suffering, and shame are a dime a dozen. Worst of all, they all seem to think that they're one of the few who has the courage to keep it real.
I just want you to know, hot take from the chat, this is just more Paul Doomerist bullshit. There's no
this chat is a bunch of dupes then.
There's no DDT.
Bunch of credulous dupes. Like, dude, we're literally sitting here making fun of a bunch of tuned out morons going back to brunch in the midst of the world burning, and these idiots are calling me a doomer in chat. Go yourselves, simpletons.
Oh, you're a
There's no DDT in the oceans. It's fine. Everything's good. Everything's fine.
Oh, yeah, the oceans are fine, bro. Yeah. Your children will thank you for your blithe attitude and your stupid trolley nature in my chat.
There are a number of reasons why pessimism is not only prevalent, but the preferred outlook. Probably the biggest reason has to do with biology. Our brains have a negativity bias that helped us survive during our evolutionary upbringing. This, combined with the news we consume, can make for a skewed worldview. As Matt Ridley writes, bad news usually matters, good news may not. In the prehistoric past, it made more sense to worry about risks. It might help you avoid getting killed by a lion than to celebrate success. Perhaps this is why people have a negativity bias. In a 2014 paper, researchers at McGill University examined which news stories their subjects chose to read for what they thought was an eye-tracking experiment. It turns out that when people say they want more good news, they are more interested in bad news. Regardless of what participants say, they exhibit a preference for negative news content, concluded the authors Mark Trussler and Stuart Soroka. Another reason I think doomerism is so prevalent here online has to do with a quotation from John Stuart Mill. As Mill wrote in 1828, I have observed that not the man who hopes when others despair, but the man who despairs when others hopes, is admired by a large class of persons as a sage. Doomers love to think of themselves as these hardened realists who are brave enough to see the world for what it really is, whereas optimists like myself are rubes who have our heads buried in the sand because we just don't have the fortitude to deal with reality. Also, they get to pretend that by keeping it real, they're actually doing something about the problems that we do have.
Go dip your do nothing, call out because you know that we're more lenient on this channel about bans, balls, and the DDT ocean, you bunch of simps.
Another important reason why there are so many doomers around us, and why they seem to be so persuasive, has to do with the way we think. To quote Matt Ridley once again, bad news is more sudden than good news, which is usually gradual. Therefore, bad news is more newsworthy. Battles, bombings, accidents, murders, storms, floods, scandal, and disaster of all kinds tend to dominate the news. If it bleeds, it leads, as they used to say in the newspaper business. By contrast, the gradual reduction in poverty in the world rarely makes a sudden splash. As Rosling put it, in the media, the newsworthy events exaggerate the unusual and put the focus on swift changes. This is part of what psychologists call the availability bias, a quirk of human cognition first noticed by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in the 1970s. People vastly overestimate the frequency of crime because crime disproportionately dominates the news. But random violence makes the news because it is rare, whereas routine kindness doesn't make the news because it is so common. I've read a lot of the world is getting better books, and I've noticed that they rely heavily on statistics. Doomers are almost never aware of these statistical trends, and if they are, they're usually very dismissive. It's not that these numbers are useless, I'll be invoking some myself later in this video. It's that they're not as compelling to individual people as anecdotal evidence. Furthermore, no optimist I know of believes that humans don't face serious challenges, that progress is inevitable and irreversible, or that no one has any serious concerns about the state of their own life or the state of the world as a whole. We do have real problems. If you're struggling to make ends meet, statistics about how global poverty has been cut in half over the last 20 years probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you. That said, I think it's still important that we talk about progress all the same. I do believe that the world is improving, and on more fronts than people know. For example, did you know that humanity is currently on a trajectory to produce less physical waste? I'm sure most of you are aware of the massive island of plastic floating around the Pacific Ocean. Sadly, there are actually several such patches in more than one ocean, but the largest and most notorious is about halfway between California and Hawaii. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch is about 1.6 million square kilometers in size. For reference, that's roughly twice the size of Texas. Most of the plastic actually doesn't come from the United States or any other developed nations, but rather developing nations in South Asia like China, Indonesia, and the Philippines. I'm sure that is small consolation for those negatively affected by this, but this actually is important for reasons beyond geography. Developed nations with relatively free economies like the United States and Great Britain produce less waste over time. The boys over at Deep Fat Fried, whose company, ironically enough, is called Pessimist Productions, allude to why this is.
A new study has found that the total mass of electronic waste generated by Americans has been declining since 2015. In an age where most of us can't imagine life without our digital devices, this surprising finding has ramifications for both how we think about electronic waste future and how and for the laws that regulate or laws and regulations regarding e-waste recycling, according to the study's authors. The study, led by Yale School of Environment's Center for Industrial Ecology and published recently in the Journal of Industrial Ecology, says the biggest contributor to this decline is the disappearance of the large, bulky cathode ray tube CRT televisions and computer monitors from American homes.
Through the 90s, you remember everything was bulky and plastic. So, it's not so much that way anymore. I would say that maybe this also underscores people's reduced ability to afford to purchase these types of products and stuff.
It's actually not because these devices are increasingly beyond the reach of more and more Americans. The exact opposite is true. Electronic devices are not only improving in quality, they're dropping in price. But that's another video for another day. Despite getting more powerful, electronic devices are also getting smaller and smaller. The article they read specifically referenced television sets. That's probably where this trend is the most obvious. I remember back in 2001, my dad bought a brand new entertainment center for $7,500, the crown jewel of which was a 32-inch HD TV set that alone cost $4,000. This was top of the line at the time, and it was massive. I remember the two moving guys struggling to bring it down into our basement. Compare that to what we have now. Just last year, I bought a 55-inch TV for $250. While it has a way bigger screen and much better picture, it was so light that I was able to carry it into my apartment all by myself. Televisions, or electronic devices more broadly, are hardly unique in this respect. Something similar has happened over the last several decades with virtually everything we consume. This is a trend known as dematerialization. In his book, More from Less, the surprising story of how we learned to prosper using fewer resources, and what happens next, author Andrew McAfee explains this trend and its fundamental causes. While it is true that capitalism coupled with the Industrial Revolution was incredibly taxing on our Earth and its resources, the exact opposite is actually true during the digital era. As McAfee writes, capitalism continued and spread. Just look around you. But tech progress changed. We invented the computer, the internet, and a suite of other digital technologies that let us dematerialize our consumption. Over time, they allowed us to consume more and more, while taking less and less from the planet. This happened because digital technologies offered the cost savings that come from substituting bits for atoms, and the intense cost pressures of capitalism caused companies to accept this offer over and over. The effort to increase profit has incentivized businesses to create the same thing using less material. This is one type of dematerialization. Automobiles are a great example of this. As cool as classic cars are, they're usually these metal, gas-guzzling death traps. Today, your average new car is made of more lightweight materials that, of course, weigh less, but also have contributed to a dramatic increase in gas mileage efficiency, not to mention safety. My favorite example of this type of dematerialization that McAfee cites comes from the replacement of steel beer cans with aluminum. In 1959, Coors pioneered beer cans made of aluminum, which is much lighter and more corrosive resistant than steel. Royal Crown Cola followed suit for soda 5 years later. As Vaclav Smil relates, A decade later, steel cans were on the way out, and none of them have been used for beer since 1994, and for soft drinks since 1996. At 85 grams, the first aluminum cans were surprisingly heavy. By 1972, the weight of a two-piece can dropped just below 21 grams. By 1988, it was less than 16 grams. A decade later, it averaged 13.6 grams. And by 2011, it was reduced to 12.75 grams. Manufacturers accomplished these reductions by making aluminum cans' walls thinner, and by making the sides and bottom from a single sheet of metal, so that only one comparatively heavy seam was needed to join the top to the rest of the can. Smeel points out that if all beverage cans used in 2010 weighed what they did in 1980, they would have required an extra 580,000 tons of aluminum, and aluminum cans kept getting lighter. In 2012, Ball Packaging introduced into the European market a 330 milliliter can that held 7.5% less than the US standard, yet at 9.5 grams weighed 25% less. Anti-capitalists love to talk about how companies seeking profit are incentivized to squeeze their workers more and more, so that their cut of the sale is bigger and bigger. What they forget is that there's more than one way to cut costs. Materials cost money that companies would rather not spend, which incentivizes dematerialization. Another type of dematerialization, one that's a little more intuitive to your average consumer, is the consolidation of multiple products into one. Take a look at this Radio Shack ad from 1991. It promoted sales on 15 different devices: a personal stereo, an AM/FM clock radio, in-ear stereo headphones, a calculator, a personal computer, a VHS camcorder, a mobile phone, a mobile CB radio, a landline phone, an answering machine, a handheld tape recorder, a fuzzbuster, three-way speakers and a subwoofer, and a 10-channel desktop scanner, which I must admit I had no idea what that last one was. Steve Chacon over at the Huffington Post, the dude who dug this ad up, pointed out that 13 out of 15 of these devices are now replaced by the smartphone you have in your pocket, the only two exceptions being the fuzzbuster and the speakers. As Chacon writes, "You'd have spent $3,054.82 in 1991 to buy all the stuff in this ad that you can now do with your phones. That amount is roughly equivalent to about $5,100 in 2012 dollars. When I argue the case that the world has improved and I bring up smartphones, people usually think it's a silly point. They argue that most people just use them for trivial ends anyways. Of course, the fact that people take for granted that most of us carry around a supercomputer in our pockets, and that you have leisure time to tool around pointlessly on your phones in the first place, are modern marvels in their own right. But let's just consider the implications for dematerialization. As Chacon pointed out, a bunch of these bulky, chintzy devices have been consolidated into a device that can fit in your pocket. But it goes further than that. If you want to listen to a song, you don't have to pop in a CD. If you want to record a video, you don't have to whip out a VHS. And if you want to record some sound, you don't need to carry around a cassette tape with you. All of these things are done digitally. There are no hard copies that will end up in a landfill. Granted, digital files exist and are transmittable because of material objects like servers and cell phone towers, but the material footprint is considerably smaller than what it once was. This isn't just anecdotal. If you look at the key natural resources used by the United States over the years, the consumption of virtually every single one is on a downward trend. According to the US Geological Survey, despite the fact that we've seen steady economic growth over the last 100 years, the consumption of aluminum, nickel, copper, steel, and gold all peaked in the 1990s and have been trending downward since. The United States is still an agricultural giant that exports more food products than virtually any other country, despite the fact that less than 1% of our working age population works on farms. Much like the labor force, agricultural inputs have decreased even though we have produced more food than ever. The US Geological Survey found that the amount of fertilizer, water, and crop acreage are either dropping or holding steady, despite the increased output. The same trend holds for construction products like stone, cement, sand and gravel, timber, and paper. So too with our consumption of energy, and as a result, our consumption of fossil fuels and the emissions they cause. The one notable exception to this is our consumption of plastic. But as McAfee notes, there are encouraging signs on this front as well. According to the Plastics Industry Trade Association, between 1970 and the start of the Great Recession in 2007, American plastic use grew at a rate of about 5.2% per year. This was more than 60% faster than the country's GDP grew over that same time period. But a very different pattern has emerged in the years since the recession ended. The growth in plastic consumption has slowed down greatly, to less than 2% per year between 2009 and 2015. This is almost 14% slower than GDP growth over the same period. So, while America is not yet post-peak in its use of plastic, it's quickly closing in on this milestone. Remember this the next time someone tells you that capitalism requires infinite growth, and hence cannot help solve problems like climate change. Now, I'm sure I lost some of you when I said the C word. Capitalism. Surely, at least one person rolled their eyes as they thought they were listening to yet another dogmatic free market fundamentalist drone on about how capitalism can solve everything. That is an exaggeration in my case, and it's absolutely not the case with Andrew McAfee. Capitalism, according to McAfee, is only one of the driving forces of improvement. I call tech progress, capitalism, public awareness, and responsive government the four horsemen of the optimist. When all four are in place, countries can improve both the human condition and the state of nature. When the four horsemen don't all ride together, people and the environment suffer. I don't necessarily agree with all that, especially the responsive government part, but I bring this up to point out that McAfee isn't some wacky libertarian like me. Honestly, I'm not even sure what his politics are. Either way, I recommend his book to anyone interested in the story of progress. There is good evidence to suggest that the world is getting better, and that's something people all over the political spectrum can appreciate.